Breaking news out of Ottawa. In a move that sent shockwaves through global semiconductor markets just 48 hours ago, the Canadian government blocked a $660 billion strategic investment deal between American tech giants and Canadian resource partners, triggering an immediate $47.3 billion sell-off in Silicon Valley semiconductor stocks. We're talking about the largest single-day market hemorrhage in the chip industry since the 2022 supply chain crisis, and American executives are scrambling to understand how their northern neighbor just pulled the rug out from under them. In the next 8 minutes, I'm going to break down exactly how Canada weaponized its critical mineral reserves to kneecap American tech dominance, why this represents a fundamental shift in North American economic power, and what this means for every smartphone, laptop, and electric vehicle that was supposed to roll off assembly lines in the next 24 months. Here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer. What happens when America's most reliable ally decides it's done playing second fiddle? Let me paint you the picture. On January 28, 2025, Canadian Prime Minister's Office issued Order in Council 2025-0147, invoking the Investment Canada Act to formally reject the proposed North American Semiconductor Alliance, a consortium deal worth $660 billion that would have given Intel, Nvidia, and Applied Materials unprecedented access to Canadian rare earth deposits in Quebec and Saskatchewan. According to documents filed with the Canadian Competition Bureau, the deal had been 18 months in the making, with American negotiators promising 85,000 new jobs and a $12 billion infrastructure investment across 3 provinces. But here's what changed everything. On December 3, 2024, the Peterson Institute for International Economics released a confidential analysis that was leaked to Canadian officials, showing that the proposed deal would have transferred operational control of 73% of Canada's lithium, cobalt, and gallium reserves to American corporate entities, essentially locking Canada into a 40-year subordinate position in the global chip supply chain. Then, on January 15, 2025, China announced its own competing $890 billion Polar Silk Road Technology Initiative, offering Canadian provinces direct partnership agreements that would bypass federal oversight and deliver semiconductor fabrication plants directly to provincial governments. The Yale Budget Lab published findings on January 22, showing that the American deal would have generated approximately $340 billion in economic value, but 82% of that value would have accrued to American shareholders, leaving Canadian provinces with essentially a raw material extraction role. And here's the date that sealed the deal's fate. On January 26, 2025, just 48 hours before the rejection, the Federal Reserve released internal projections showing that American semiconductor firms were planning to use Canadian minerals at 40% below market rate through transfer pricing mechanisms, effectively subsidizing American chip production with Canadian natural resources valued at $280 billion over the contract lifetime. So how exactly does this work? Think of it like this. Imagine you own a house with a gold mine in the basement, and your neighbor offers to help you dig it up in exchange for 85% of the gold, claiming they have better equipment and expertise. That's essentially what the North American Semiconductor Alliance proposed. The mechanism worked through a complex 3-layer corporate structure. Layer 1, American firms would establish Canadian subsidiary corporations with nominal Canadian registration but full operational control, residing with Delaware incorporated parent companies. Layer 2, these subsidiaries would sign 40-year mineral extraction agreements with provincial governments, paying royalties calculated on extracted tonnage rather than market value, a critical distinction that Canadian economists valued at approximately $6. $8 billion annually in lost revenue. Layer 3, the extracted rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, and gallium, would be processed at facilities technically located on Canadian soil, but operating under American export licenses, meaning Canada would have zero control over where these critical materials ultimately shipped. According to analysis from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, this structure would have effectively created a resource colony relationship, where Canada provided raw materials, America captured the value-added manufacturing, and Canadian workers were locked into extraction-level wages while American engineers earned the semiconductor fabrication premiums. The data shows exactly how devastating this math becomes. A kilogram of raw lithium carbonate from Quebec mines sells for approximately $41. That same lithium, processed into battery-grade material, sells for $340 per kilogram, and when incorporated into advanced semiconductor substrates, the value jumps to $12,000 per kilogram of finished product. Under the proposed deal, Canada would have been locked into that $41 per kilogram tier, watching American firms capture the $11,959 in value-added processing. Multiply that across 4 million metric tons of projected extraction over 40 years, and you're looking at $7 trillion in foregone economic value for Canadian provinces, and it gets worse. Meet Sarah Chen, 34, senior process engineer at a lithium refinery outside of Montreal, Quebec. Sarah spent 7 years earning her chemical engineering degree from McGill University, graduated with $67,000 in student debt, and took a position at what she thought would be Canada's flagship advanced materials facility. When the semiconductor deal was announced in July 2023, her company's executives promised that American investment would mean cutting-edge fabrication technology, skills transfer, and wage parity with American counterparts doing identical work. Sarah's salary in 2024 was $89,000 Canadian, roughly $65,000 American. According to leaked internal documents from the proposed consortium, the operational plan called for Canadian facilities to remain in Stage 1 processing, meaning Sarah and her 340 colleagues would continue basic extraction and primary refining, while all advanced semiconductor-grade processing would happen at Intel facilities in Arizona and NVIDIA labs in California, where equivalent engineers earn $187,000 annually. The math was devastating. Sarah calculated that under the deal structure, her facility would process approximately $840 million worth of lithium annually. But because they would be locked into raw material pricing, the facility's total payroll budget would remain capped at $31 million, preserving the labor cost advantage that made Canadian operations attractive to American firms in the first place. Sarah faced an impossible choice: accept that her advanced degree would be permanently underutilized in a glorified mining operation, or leave Canada entirely to find work that matched her qualifications. When the deal was blocked on January 28th, Sarah told CBC News, "For the first time in my career, I feel like my government actually valued my expertise as something more than cheap labor for American profit margins." But Sarah's story is just one data point. Meet Robert Fontaine, 52, third-generation farmer in Saskatchewan, who owns 1,840 acres that sit directly above one of North America's richest cobalt deposits. In 2023, American negotiators approached Robert with an offer: lease the mineral rights for $340 per acre annually, totaling $600 per year, guaranteed for 40 years. For a farmer whose canola and wheat operations netted roughly $180,000 in a good year, this looked like generational wealth. Robert's son, Michael, 26, had already left for Calgary, unable to see a future in agriculture. The mineral lease looked like the lifeline that could bring him home, fund expansion, secure the family legacy. But here's what the contract fine print revealed, and what Saskatchewan's provincial auditor caught during the review process. The $340 per acre rate was locked for the entire 40-year term with no inflation adjustment, meaning that by 2065, Robert would still be receiving $625,600 annually, while the cobalt extracted from his land, valued at current market rates, would be worth approximately $340 million per year. The real kicker? The contract included a clause preventing Robert from leasing those same mineral rights to any competing entity, effectively sterilizing his land's most valuable asset for 4 decades in exchange for what economists calculated as 18% of the resource's true value. Robert told the Regina Leader Post, "They came to my kitchen table with fancy presentations talking about partnership and shared prosperity. What they actually put in the contract was a scheme to pay me 1990s rates for 2060s commodities. When Ottawa blocked this deal, they saved my grandchildren from a generational theft I almost didn't see coming." And it gets worse. Meet Jennifer Park, 41, supply chain director for a Toronto-based electric vehicle startup called Northvolt Automotive, one of 6 Canadian companies that had been banking on domestic access to semiconductor chips for their 2026 production vehicles. Jennifer's company had raised $340 million in venture capital based on projections that the Semiconductor Alliance would guarantee Canadian EV manufacturers priority access to chips at a 15% discount compared to international market rates, the kind of advantage that could make Canadian EVs globally competitive. According to her production timeline, Northvolt was supposed to begin assembly of 40,000 vehicles in September 2026, with each vehicle requiring approximately $2,800 worth of advanced semiconductors for battery management, autonomous driving features, and power systems. But here's what Jennifer discovered when she actually read the Semiconductor Alliance's supply agreement. The priority access clause only activated after American automotive manufacturers had filled their orders, and the 15% discount was calculated against a reference price that the American consortium could adjust quarterly based on their own cost structures. Translation: Canadian companies would get chips only when American companies didn't want them, at prices that could be manipulated to eliminate any competitive advantage. Jennifer told the Toronto Star, "We were about to build our entire production strategy around a supply chain that would have made us permanently dependent on American generosity." The day Ottawa killed this deal, I spent 6 hours on calls with South Korean and Taiwanese chip manufacturers. Turns out, when you're not locked into a captive supply relationship, you have actual negotiating power. We just signed a deal with Samsung that's 22% cheaper than what the American consortium was offering. Multiply these stories by thousands, and you begin to understand the scale of what almost happened. According to analysis from the Canadian Labour Congress, the semiconductor deal would have directly affected 127,000 Canadian workers in mining, refining, advanced manufacturing, and technology sectors, locking them into wage structures that economists projected would lag American equivalents by 35–40% while performing identical technical work. The Brookings Institution released a study on January 30th showing that over the 40-year contract period, the wage differential alone would have transferred approximately $89 billion from Canadian workers' pockets to American corporate profit margins. This wasn't a partnership. This was a resource extraction scheme wrapped in the language of North American cooperation. Let me be crystal clear about what experts are saying. According to Dr. Michael Pettis, professor of finance at Peking University and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, Canada just demonstrated that mid-sized economies are done accepting subordinate positions in supply chains designed to benefit great power competitors. This is the most significant assertion of economic sovereignty by a G7 nation in the 21st century. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published analysis on February 1st showing that Canada's rejection has already triggered similar reviews in Australia, Norway, and Chile, 3 other critical mineral-rich nations that had been negotiating comparable deals with American and Chinese tech consortiums. Nouriel Roubini, the economist who predicted the 2008 financial crisis, told Bloomberg on February 2nd, Silicon Valley's business model for the past decade has relied on securing underpriced access to critical inputs through geopolitical leverage. Canada just proved that model is dead. Semiconductor firms are going to face a 20–30% increase in input costs as resource-rich nations demand value-added processing domestically. The Peterson Institute updated its projections on February 3rd, estimating that if Canada successfully pivots to domestic semiconductor fabrication using its own minerals, the country could add $67 billion annually to GDP by 2035, creating a technology sector that rivals California's on a per capita basis. But here's what really concerns analysts in the next 30 to 90 days. American semiconductor firms, already operating on razor-thin margins due to competition from Taiwan, South Korea, and increasingly China, will face immediate pressure to secure alternative rare earth supplies at significantly higher prices, potentially triggering a 12–18% increase in chip costs that will ripple through every sector from automotive to consumer electronics to defense systems. But here's the kicker. Over the next 6 to 12 months, Canada is expected to announce partnerships with European and Asian semiconductor manufacturers, specifically ASML from the Netherlands, Samsung from South Korea, and possibly TSMC from Taiwan, companies that are willing to build full-stack fabrication facilities on Canadian soil in exchange for long-term supply agreements at market rates. According to leaked documents obtained by the Financial Times, these negotiations include technology transfer provisions that would train Canadian engineers in advanced chip design, something the American deal explicitly prohibited in order to maintain Silicon Valley's technical advantage. What this means is that Canada isn't just blocking American access, they're building a competing semiconductor ecosystem that could fragment the global chip supply chain in ways that fundamentally reshape technological power. And here's what really concerns analysts: the permanent damage to American strategic assumptions. For 75 years, American foreign policy has operated on the belief that allied nations would subordinate their economic interests to maintain the American-led order. Canada, the closest ally, the most integrated economy, just shattered that assumption. If Canada is willing to say no, what stops Germany from demanding equity stakes in American AI companies? What stops Japan from requiring technology transfer in exchange for rare earth access? What stops every mid-sized advanced economy from recognizing that they've been undervaluing their strategic assets for decades? The semiconductor rejection isn't just about chips. It's about the end of an era where American firms could design global supply chains purely for American benefit and expect allied nations to smile and accept the crumbs. Let's recap the three critical points. First, Canada just blocked a $660 billion deal that would have locked Canadian workers and provinces into a 40-year subordinate role in the semiconductor supply chain, extracting raw materials at 1990s prices, while American firms captured trillions in value-added manufacturing. Second, the scale of what Canada rejected is staggering. $1, $7 trillion in foregone economic value, 127,000 workers locked into artificially suppressed wages, and entire provincial economies reduced to resource extraction colonies for Silicon Valley's benefit. Third, the permanent consequence is that Canada's rejection has triggered a fundamental reassessment of resource for technology deals globally, potentially increasing American semiconductor input costs by 20–30%, while mid-sized economies build competing technology sectors that could challenge American dominance within a decade. If this analysis helped you understand what's really happening in the semiconductor wars, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is just beginning and the implications are going to reshape technology, economics, and geopolitics for the next generation. Drop a comment below. Do you think Canada made the right call, or did they just sabotage North American competitiveness? Here's what keeps me up at night. For decades, we've been told that globalization was about mutual benefit, rising tides lifting all boats, win-win partnerships between allies. Canada just read the fine print and discovered that the deal was never designed to be mutual. It was designed to be extractive, to lock them into permanent subordination, while American firms captured all the value. And if that was happening to our closest ally, the most integrated economy, the nation we share the longest undefended border with, what does that say about every other partnership agreement we've signed? What does that say about the entire architecture of American-led economic order? Canada didn't just block a semiconductor deal. They held up a mirror to American economic statecraft, and what they saw was a system designed to benefit one country at everyone else's expense. That mirror is going to be very, very hard to put away.